Hey everyone and welcome. This video is going to be geared towards everybody who's really just starting with sim racing and wants to have a rough idea of what literally every setup option does to the car in a really simplified way. And for that, we'll just take, as I say, really simplified way. There's always going to be an exception. A thing certainly means a bit more than I'm going to show it in this video. But to get a first understanding and to know into which direction you're affecting the car when touching certain aspects of the setup, this hopefully, well, helps you get started at least. And then, yeah, setups are just a complex thing. Things are connected to one another, and there's no way around really diving deeper. So this is really the starting point to diving deeper later. For that, all I want to really do is go to the car setup and go through a few things. So we start with the aggressive preset, and we're literally going to go through all the settings and give them a really quick, well, idea and what they do in terms of over and understeer. In fact, starting with the tire pressures, they don't really affect over and understeer in a way that you can do it on a single slider, but you could say that in general, if you have wrong pressures on one axle, say you're weighted high on the front or you're weighted low on the rear, that axle is going to suffer from grip. So let's say you have the rear tires on good pressures. Let's just assume the middle here for whatever reason is good pressures, okay? And the fronts are way over pressured, so they're going to have less grip than the rear tires, means you can develop a bit of, or the car is going to behave a bit understeery from that. If the opposite is happening, the front tires are well in the pressure zone, but the rear tires are way under pressured or over pressured, doesn't really matter. The rear tires are going to have less grip than the front tires, meaning you'll likely have oversteer, okay? Then talking about the toes, you'll have cars that can even have negative values here on front and rear. Generally, negative toe isn't a normal thing with racing cars, but in the game so far it seems to work, and actually all simulation games have that issue. The more negative you turn the toe, the more oversteer the car is going to have. The more positive you turn the toe, the more understeer the car is going to have. This is true for the rear axle. The front axle, we want to think a bit differently about the toe, not so much in terms of grip, but in terms of how quickly the car responds to your steering input. Can you even see the steering wheel? Probably a tiny bit, hopefully. So if you turn the toe on the front axle positive, means the tires are looking, you're looking from the front onto the car, tires are pointing towards one another. Which just means the tire is always already kind of trying to go for the corner, and once you shift the load over to that side, the tire is going to respond really quickly. On the other hand, if you go really negative, the tires are facing outward on the front a bit, and it actually takes a bit of time when you start turning into the corner that the outside tire will actually go for the corner. So there's a bit of a delay from turning the steering wheel to the car actually starting to rotate. Then we have cambers, and I have a few clips made so I can show you what it actually does and why it's needed. Generally, you can say, of course, in theory, there are too high camber values, but the way the game is and the way the range of setup options that we have, maximum camber is usually needed. The reason simply is that cars are very dynamic. They move all the time. The tires move up and down, the weight shifts from left to the right, the car rolls from left to right or right to left, and the car pitches from front to rear or rear to front. And all this rolling especially means that even if it's subtle and not that much, and you'll see that in the clips, is that when the tires have this angle and the whole car rolls over to that side or to this side, suddenly that camber tire looks pretty flat on the surface. I'm exaggerating again, of course, but this is why you need the camber in general. Now, in terms of over and understeer, say you're removing front camber, let's say quite a lot, then suddenly the front tires, when the car leans into the corner, are not going to produce the same amount of grip as they did before. which means the front axle is likely going to have less grip than the rear, which again means you'll have understeer. Do the opposite, keep the camber really high on the front, make it really low on the rear, or just a tiny bit less, whatever, and you'll make the car oversteer a tiny bit more. Okay, so we have the few first options covered. Then there's the caster, which kind of works in conjunction with the caster. In a simplified way, it simply means the more caster you run, the more camber is still going to be there once you start turning the steering wheel. So usually you want to run caster pretty high, because we never have enough camber, basically. There can be rare occasion where you have, but normally you don't. Traction control settings, I think they're self-explaining. The lower the traction control or off, the more oversteer you're going to have. The lower the ABS and the more the fronts lock up, the more understeer you're going to have. But both is pretty undesirable. We're never going to use 0 on any electronics, so just probably keep them default, especially in the BMW 3 for anything is fine. The ECU map just controls how much power the engine has, how much it consumes, doesn't really have impact on over-understeer, so we leave that aside. Telemetry laps just means how many laps you're recording in the data, so no effect there. He is also not that much in regards to over and understeer, but maybe we symbolize this a different way by going to the aero tab. So we're going to make the fuel tank really empty. Then we go to the aero tab, and what we're going to do is we put it on the same 5 liters here. Now you can see the radite that was set up is 52 millimeters on the front, 58 on the rear. Now, if you increase the fuel tank, you can see we're down to 51 on the front, so minus 1 millimeter, and down to 55 on the rear. I think we were coming from 58, right? So we lost like 3 millimeters of radite on the rear. What this just shows you is the fuel tank in this car is rather to the back and affects the radite on the rear more, which also means the weight is probably of the tank kind of located behind the center of the car, which just means if there's more fuel in the back, this will lead to more oversteery behavior when the car is with a full tank. The brake pads really, they don't really affect over understeer, so we leave that aside here as well. And we move on to the mechanical grip page, and I'm doing this really simplified, okay, for everyone to get a first understanding. And we're only really going to separate into over and understeer, which is an oversimplification. There's more to it, but as a first starting point, I'd say it's legitimate. So the roll bars, they help shifting weight from one side to the other or help prevent it. Generally, all you have to know is more front roll bar will roughly mean more understeer. Less front roll bar will mean more oversteer. Let's just keep it very simple, okay? The same then is true for the rear axle. A higher roll bar on the rear is going to cause oversteer. A lower rear roll bar is going to help a bit create more understeer. That's all you got to know. Then we have the wheel rates. Similar thing. The harder the front is, the more understeer you're going to have. The softer the rear is, the more understeer you're going to have. Shift it around, make the front soft, make the rear really stiff. You're going to have a really oversteery car. Where do we go next? Brake bias, I think. Also, yeah, over understeers might be a stretch. Let's talk that in terms of stability, instability under braking. So the more the brake bias is towards the front, the more the front tires will be overloaded during braking, and the more likely the car is going to understeer into a corner. However, if you go really low on the brake bias, the rear tires will be used more for braking. They will likely lock up if you shift this value very far to the back, which causes a bit more oversteer. Then we have the bump stop rate. This is all a bit more complex, and I think before we talk about the rate, we have to talk about what the bump stop in general does. So what we want to understand about the bump stop range is it controls the amount of travel the suspension will have on that axle. Generally, what you want to remember here is the more range you give the front axle, the closer it is allowed to the ground, the more downforce it will produce. In general, there are always exceptions, car function differently. As a general rule, the more bump stop range you have on the front, the more downforce the front end will produce under braking, the lower it will tuck in on the straight, the more oversteer you're going to produce. Same thing if you reduce the bump stop range on the rear, meaning you're not allowing the rear end to compress, but it always kind of is forced high in the air. Your car pretty much from the side looks like this, with this being the front, this being the rear. You're limiting the rear suspension travel, which in the end means you're creating oversteer. Do it the other way around. Limit the bump stop range on the front, give it a lot bump stop range on the rear. Well, I missed a button here. So do it like this. Don't allow the front suspension to move, but allow the rear suspension to move a lot. You're most likely creating a setup that's going to be more understeery. Of course, it interacts with everything else you've set up, but as a general tendency, this is how those things are going to affect the car. For the bump stop range, just think of that of an extension of what I just described with the range. So the harder you make the bump stop range, the stiffer this rubber is going to be. That is limiting the suspension travel. So if you're already on 0 here and maximum bump stop rate, you're going to have even less movable front axle. The opposite is true if we make it really soft. There's a bit more room given for the rear suspension to move because the rubber itself gives in a bit. Then we have the preload. The impact of that is rather little. And it depends really on the driving situation that you're in. I'd rather say going to the maximum is going to create oversteer on throttle. Going to the minimum is going to create oversteer under braking. So this is kind of a trade-off always, and the opposite is going to happen during acceleration. Have a really low preload on acceleration. The inside wheel of the rear axle probably spins up, which is more or less going to cause understeer. And if you go really stiff with a preload, then you'll have a very stable car under braking at least. But probably leave that out of the equation. Leave it to whatever value as a start. This is not that impactful for you. As for dampers, I want to leave them out of the equation because they are really for fine-tuning, so we're not going to touch on that in this video. But there's something way more influential, and this is certainly the ride height settings. And also just want to give you a rough indication of what is causing over, what is causing understeer. As we already touched on the suspension, the more the car is allowed to the front, the more downforce it's going to produce. So, and we can really see that with a value down below here, which indicates how much the downforce is shifted towards the front. The number is going to be different for every car, and it's not necessarily meaning the same in every situation. It's very variable. However, as a rough indication, this car is here. Can we get it to like 3%? There you go. Let's talk 3%, okay? And now if we reduce the front ride height, we can force the car to be more oversteery because more downforce is going to be produced at the front. So we lower this and we can see accordingly the aero variation moves to the front. More downforce is created at the front compared to the rear. And now the front end has a bit more bite and the rear end has trouble following that, causing oversteer. Let's do the same, and the BMWs already and other cars are very specific in their aerodynamic properties, but let's put the rear really, really high and you'll see this number shift even further forward, which means the front now produces even more downforce, the rear in comparison less, and the car is even more oversteery. If we do the exact opposite now, do the rear really low, do the front really high, suddenly we have an aero balance that is -5, meaning the whole aerodynamic balance shifted a lot backwards. The front is producing less downforce, the rear is producing more in comparison to the front, and this means the car is going to be really, really understeery now in corners. The same, very easy for the rear wing. The more rear wing you have, the more understeery the car becomes. This is actually the first time I'm going to the maximum values the car has. So -6.3 is the most understeery behavior you're going to have in that car. But if you remove the rear wing, you can see we're going way more closer to an oversteery car. You'll never drive the car like this, don't even try. But just to give you an idea, going higher on the front is going to cause understeer, going lower on the front, oversteer, higher on the rear, oversteer, lower on the rear, understeer. Higher with the wing, understeer, lower with the wing, oversteer. And I think this should really be everything that you need to know to get started dialing, playing with the feeling of creating over and understeer in the setup. And please never go min or max. Just start slowly, do one click at a time, try to feel the impact, get a feeling for what the car really, how the behavior changes, what that impact of the setup is, in which situation. Is it on corner entry? Is it middle of the corner? Is it on corner exit? And through that, you can experiment and really develop a feeling for how to set up a car a bit on your own. And I'm gonna close the video here. I thank you all for watching. And yep, pretty much let me know in the comments if this is any useful or which questions there still remain. So